So let's talk about one pathway to masters of miniatures with a vast array of cool designs and potentially at a fraction of a price from Games Workshop plastic kits with an overview of 3D printing for Warhammer in 2024. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought I'd return to the subject of 3D printing, and this one talk about a rough guide for getting a 3D printer off the ground and basically having your own little miniature factory in your home. An interesting little subsection of the hobby and can be a pathway to getting fun miniature designs and potentially saving a lot of money in the long run. It's no secret for the actual miniatures that you get that Warhammer can be kind of expensive. In a recent video I took a look at some of the cheapest possible armies that every single faction could make at 2000 points. Here's just one example for the Astra Militarum, around about $660. For the cheapest guard army list that you can make at 2000 points, and that one consists of 8 fairly big chunky tanks. And certainly if you wanted to add a significant infantry component to the army, it would cost massively more than this. Obviously, Guard isn't the cheapest Warhammer 40k army out there, but it is kind of funny that the cheapest possible big army for these guys still clocks in at around about $660. Definitely the sort of price tag that might have people priced out or considering other options. Certainly over the past few years, 3D printing has been maturing steadily. Lots of prices and offerings getting significantly cheaper and significantly better quality than it was when it first came out. And it's quite a common talking point that you could often pick up a 3D printer, all the trappings and things, and pay a similar sort of amount as a cheap Warhammer army. And for the Guard example, you can afford something that's a fairly mid-level. This definitely isn't an entry point set of things. Going by Elegoo examples, you could get a Saturn 3 12K 3D printer, a Mercury X slightly fancy wash and cure machine, and then 4 kilograms of resin, and pay roughly the same sort of price tag. Obviously you need to do a fair bit of work beyond this, finding designs and troubleshooting and things, plus you might need to pay a little bit more for depending on where you're getting the designs that you want to print from. But in theory, if you went on to print more miniatures beyond this, from there on you'd be in massive savings over plastic kits. In this video I thought it would be good to do a bit of an overview of 3D printing, basically aimed as a guide for newer players just to generally get the gist of what you might be aiming for. And in this one we'll go through the pros and cons of 3D printing, some ideas for choosing a 3D printer, mainly focusing on the Elegoo range, and talk a little bit about the basics of resin printing in general, some thoughts as to the application of FDM printers, and then what to print with resin ones, such as miniatures with some examples and some basics, aesthetics and terrain. Then finish up with a bunch of supporting topics, places to find STLs, a few thoughts on playing games with 3D prints, a few basic troubleshooting things, and finishing up with some very important safety tips. I would still stress though that I certainly consider myself a beginner to 3D printing. This one really isn't aimed to be an in-depth technical guide or anything like that. You can find that done far better on other channels, to be honest. It's more of a discussion around the topic and maybe looking at the bits that you want to further research later, and particularly applying 3D printing technology to Warhammer in specific, as I know that that's what most of you guys on the channel will be most interested in. First up, I would start by saying there are definitely some pros and cons of 3D printing to support a Warhammer hobby, and in general I'd argue the two major advantages are money and flexibility. As mentioned with the previous example, you could set up an entire 3D printer setup for a similar sort of cost to a entry-level Warhammer army, and it means that if you do intend to be buying multiple armies, you could potentially save massive amounts of money and get way more miniatures out of it, compared with going down the plastic kits route, if you're kind of happy with either of the miniature designs equally. The other really big advantage is that, say, compared with being a Warhammer purist and getting miniature designs elsewhere from Games Workshop, you'd have far more choice of sculpts with custom and bespoke parts made by all sorts of creators. The library of STLs out there on the internet for wargaming is just getting better all the time. Loads of creators making new things every month, and it's reached the point where there's really quite a back catalogue for all sorts of things out there now. And you can certainly make some interesting combinations, mixing parts from multiple creators, or getting aesthetic upgrades and things to really make a collection your own. As well as that, lots of people just enjoy it as a hobby in its own right. You do get to run your own little miniature factory, and certainly as hobbyists we get a lot of interest in making cool looking miniatures appear on the table and look really great. This can be a great way to do so. For the main disadvantages of 3D printing, I'd say perhaps the single biggest one is time. It is a hobby in its own right, and it's going to take a while to learn the technical aspects versus just clipping out some models from a plastic kit and gluing them together. There's a fair number of things that you could really do with doing right. I certainly expect at least some teething issues, You are occasionally going to have annoyances like failed prints, maybe damage to components and needing to replace things. Some people definitely have massively better or worse experiences when it comes to that. Perhaps the other major one is safety, needing to be careful with the chemicals that you have and somewhere safe for the printer to run. I'll cycle back to that at the end of the video, but you might want to think twice if you don't think you're the sort of person who's realistically going to treat the toxic resin with respect. You really don't want to be damaging your health by not doing things properly. Otherwise, can be some issues or muted reception to proxy or stand-in miniatures. It might have some drawbacks, like not being permitted in, say, Games Workshop events, and people out there in the community can be a bit more or less receptive to them. I've certainly heard a fair few anecdotes with people having slightly diminishing returns on printing far more miniatures than they could ever possibly paint. The excitement of having your own little miniature factory could certainly lead to its own version of a pile of shame. If you do think that 3D printing is right for you, though, perhaps one of the most obvious places to start are the printers themselves. There's two main types of 3D printing: the filament FDM printers that have heated filament passed through a nozzle to make the print, versus resin printers, which are a bit more high tech and have a vat of resin which is used to print with UV light. In general, for miniature wargaming, the resin printers tend to be the mainstay here. They have far more details, particularly if you want to print infantry models or characters, then they're going to be the ones that you want to go for. And generally for people talking about 3D printing Warhammer proxy type models, the resin ones are the ones that they usually are talking about. I'll briefly cycle back to FDM printers again later, so first let's talk a bit about resin ones. The examples I'm going to use here are from Elegoo, one of the best and most well respected manufacturers of them, and most commonly used for Warhammer proxy sort of purposes. I will leave links to them down in the video description if you did choose to pick up anything through those. Anything bought through those does help to support Allspec Tactics a little bit, though they haven't sponsored this video or anything. They're just the brand that's most familiar. There's plenty of other ones out there, such as Anycubic, Unimold Formation, and Creality being some of the other major competitors. In general, though, Elegoo are certainly considered to be one of the industry leaders here. If you just wanted to dip your toe into 3D printing, then one example for an entry-level one might be the Mars 4 9K. The Elegoo Mars series is their smaller compact one. This one goes for $260, though there are a few models floating around out there that will be quite a bit less. The single cheapest one that they have on offer is the Mars 3 4K, which is less than $150. That's be a similar sort of size of printer, though would have less detail than the 9K one. Technology really has matured pretty rapidly here, and they're getting more detailed all the time. If your aim is just to get in at a very low entry point and have a play with the technology, then basically any of the Mars series are a pretty good choice, I think. I guess their main downside is the build volume, 15 centimeters by a bit less than 8 by 17. It means some larger miniatures or squads might need multiple slices to be able to put them together, and larger squads might need multiple print runs. You can certainly print a small squad of infantry within that build volume, though. For a lot of people, I think that this will be the right choice as an entry-level one. It really is quite compact and has a fairly good build volume for how small it is compared with some competitors, and the later versions like this 9K one do have far greater detail than they used to. For the basics of how resin printers work, you'll have some sort of setup like this. This is roughly what they look like without that red protective cover in place. You upload STL files to the printer via the slicing software that you have, and then you have a vat of resin that you can see at the base here. That's the black bit. And then the flat surface that you can see hanging down there is the build plate. What happens is that build plate starts flush with the vat of resin, and then the printer uses a UV light to solidify layers onto the build plate, building up your model creation bit by bit. As the build plate rises up out of the vat, then something like this will develop. Here you can see the printed miniature attached to the build plate which is above it. As it rises up, you'll have the model assemble alongside its supports, all the little scaffolding type bits to attach the miniature and make sure that the overhanging parts don't fail and fall apart. It'll usually take a fair few hours for this to happen, somewhere in the region of maybe 2 to 8 hours, depending on the exact printer and the model and the complexity of the design that you're printing. So it's a kind of slow process that you set to run and then check back later when it's done. For an example of maybe a slightly more general purpose and mid-level entry point, you'd have something like the Elegoo Saturn series. This one is the Saturn 312K. Compared with the Mars series, this is a bit more of an investment, though maybe not crazily more. The Saturn 12K one is $380. The main advantage being that you have really quite a much bigger build space here. This one's 22 by 12 by 25 centimeters, massively more space there. Particularly the extra width is kind of handy for bigger tanks and vehicles and things. It means that you might just need a little bit less user effort, as you don't have to do quite as many print runs. Just set one big one going and then off you go. You don't have to spend quite as much time resetting the printer. The resolution on this one is kind of similar to the Mars 9K. The 9K and 12K don't necessarily mean that you've got more or less resolution, though generally high numbers are better there. It actually maybe is a bit more important as to the pixel resolution on them. The Mars 9K does actually work out as being slightly higher resolution than the Saturn 3 12K. Still though, either of these are absolutely fine for detailed miniature printing, and far better than where the technology was just a few years ago. If you were looking to pick up any of these from Elegoo, I'll leave the links down in the video description. Here's a rough idea of what a typical 3D printer might come with. You get some basic safety equipment for keeping resin away from human flesh, a mask, a set of gloves, a funnel for pouring resin, a scraper for removing models from the build plate, and most modern 3D printers tend to come with an air purifier as well to try and keep smells down, though I still want to have it being run somewhere that isn't a place that I'm working all the time, and somewhere that's well ventilated. For just a very rough idea of the typical print process, what you usually need to do is set up the printer as per the instructions it comes with. Perhaps particularly important is to calibrate a flat build plate, making sure that it's flat with the FEP sheet, and the entire printer itself mounted somewhere stable and flat so you don't get resin all on one side of the tray or anything. Then you need to find the STL files for a model that you'd want to print. You arrange it with the slicing software. There's usually one that comes built in with the printer, though there's third-party ones available such as Lychee. You get a build plate sort of area like this one you can see on the right, and you can arrange your model or models there, plus seeing any supporting components. Depending on the exact STL that you've got, you might need to add additional supports in yourself. Plenty of scaffolding can give you less chance of print failure, particularly for overhanging bits. Then load the resin into the vat safely, as mentioned, taking extreme care. 3D printers need to be calibrated to the type of resin used, though typically if using manufacturer's advice, it's probably not going to go too far wrong unless you have extremes of temperature or humidity where you live. Then you set the thing to print. Again, time could be very variable depending on settings and exactly what printer you have and what design you're making. It rises off the vat, as you can see here. You then take the build plate and scrape it off with a spatula. Wash the miniature in isopropyl alcohol to remove any uncured resin from the surface with either a brush or a wash machine, breaking off the supports at this time as well, and then you cure the model potentially in a cure machine or manually using sunlight. The process is at least a little bit involved. I certainly recommend checking out the multiple great tutorials that all sorts of other creators have here on YouTube. Can really give you a feel for what you're doing, and a few practical tips for each step. As just mentioned, another really important step in the process is washing and curing resin miniatures when you've basically printed them. Some people do like to DIY the whole washing and curing process. You can have it for very cheap if you've got a good setup for it. It can be as simple as a UV lamp or just sunlight if you live somewhere where sunlight is reliable. The UK probably wouldn't be appropriate for that though. If you had that and then your own vat of isopropyl alcohol or methylated spirits, you could do a pretty effective DIY solution. Though for me personally, I would rather go with the reliability of a dedicated bought station. Generally, I'd say that the consensus for recommendations is that it's probably worth the time, effort, and hassle that you save yourself, and getting maybe a slightly more reliable result. Again, lots of manufacturers do make these. Elegoo's solution is the Mercury series of wash and cure stations. They look kind of fancy, but maybe aren't quite as technical as a 3D printer itself. It basically amounts to a contained mini little whirlpool of IPA or whatever else you're using to wash your miniature in, and a turntable for the miniature itself, plus some UV lamps to make sure that the resin is fully cured and hardened and is safe to be handled from there. Elegoo's one, again linked down in the video description, is $170 for this Mercury X one. They do have more cheaper basic ones for around about the $100 mark though. Those are the main basics of resin printers, though as mentioned there is the FDM printer option, and while these maybe aren't the front focus for most wargaming needs, they can still have a very good purpose if you wanted one of these. Basically these are good for printing big stuff, anything where the layer lines that these things give you won't have too great an effect on the model overall. The main advantages are they usually have a much bigger build volume, so it can be good for big stuff from there. They are a bit lower tech to operate, with basically a nozzle that squeezes out filaments and then makes the print from there, so not having to handle toxic resin and things, though they do come with their own set of troubleshooting issues such as clogs in the nozzle. The parts they make tend to be a bit sturdier than the more brittle resin, can be quite hard wearing, and in general they'll cost you far less than a resin printer would. A slightly fancier model here is Elegoo's recent Neptune 3. That one will be around about $300 for an absolutely massive build volume, though they do have other things within that same Neptune range around about the $100 to $150 mark. The most common applications within the wargaming community tends to be for terrain pieces, where the little ridges that you get really aren't that big an issue. They can just be seen as part of the texture for ruined buildings or whatever else you're printing. And in general, for bigger vehicles and tanks and things, I feel like the fine details maybe aren't quite as important, and you'd still generally get a pretty acceptable shape for a big vehicle. Depends about how much you care about those layer lines. Certainly for something like a really big model, like something Knight or Titan sized, it might be the way to go. Moving on from the prints themselves, the question then becomes what might you want to print? I'm sure plenty of people might well have seen some cool 3D printed designs floating around out there that people use in games. I say for Warhammer 40k printing purposes, maybe the most common use of a 3D printer is to make some close proxies for Warhammer miniatures. Use designs sculpted by other creators, which are completely different sculpts from Games Workshop miniatures, but also might be close enough to be considered a proxy for them. Some things maybe tend to be a little bit more on the nose than others for this. For example, some creators you could clearly tell are trying to make, say, a Not Custodes type miniature, whereas for things like the Astra Militarum or the Leagues of Votan, for example, it can sometimes be a little bit less clear where the line is drawn. It's not like Games Workshop can stop people from making sci-fi human infantry or dwarf infantry in space. There's loads of Imperial Guard potential stand-ins out there, just as sci-fi human infantry is something that lots of people have their own takes on. There's definitely plenty of people out there who also just try and make exact copies of Games Workshop models, essentially just make STLs that basically are Warhammer 40k miniatures, so pretty much just rip off Games Workshop directly there. It'd certainly be illegal to distribute, given that their Games Workshop's designs and IP and things, and I'm sure they'd come down hard on that whenever they possibly could. For me personally, that wouldn't be a route that I'd choose to go down, though I know plenty of people do. I feel like there's so many close designs out there that there's just not really all that much need to 100% clone Games Workshop's products. In general, I feel like the designs that I've often seen it done for tend to be the big Forge World vehicles and things, often things that are just so astronomically priced compared with other things that lots of people just wouldn't consider them otherwise. As mentioned earlier, it can be a big money saver. As seen before, a mid-price 3D printer plus wash and cure station and lots of resin could be under $700. An absolute basic entry 3D printer, wash and cure station, and a bottle of resin could be under $300. It really is quite a low entry point compared with how it's been previously. For a couple of examples of ranges of 3D printed miniatures, you often maybe have to be a little bit careful as to what sort of things are shared. As I learned from a past video, there are certain creators out there who might not really want their work showcased too hard to Games Workshop. So for this video at least, I'll stick to just a couple of the really major established players and talk about a few things from OnePageRules and the Maker's Cult, a couple of creators who have been around for long enough to know what they can and can't get away with, making their own miniature ranges that just so happen to be able to be stood in for Warhammer miniatures, but not overstepping the mark. OnePageRules I'm sure will be well familiar to plenty of people out there. They make their own sci-fi game, Grim Dark Future, quite a popular one that sometimes people check out when they get a bit burnt out with 40k. And for their miniature races, they often have things that follow similar sort of aesthetics to the 40k armies. They won't necessarily have every single miniature just be a direct one-to-one copy. You can check out their designs via their Patreon website and their My Mini Factory page. Just for some examples, here's their Dwarf Guilds range, a whole bunch of sci-fi dwarves including artillery, melee units with spears and shields, and jump infantry as seen on the previous slide. I've got a range called Blessed Sisters, which could be good stand-ins for Sisters of Battle, very much going for the same sort of nuns with guns vibe as in Warhammer 40k. The ones on the left might make some appropriate Celestian Sacrosants, the ones on the right might be good for various armor marks. And for another example, they have a fun Robot Legions range. I feel like if you were to use these as a stand-in for 40k, it'd likely be Necrons. I would say that their vibe and feel is a fair bit different. The ones on the left could make for some interesting sword and board infantry, maybe somewhat similar to Lichguard, and maybe the one on the right could be something like a Triarch Stalker or a Canoptech creation of some sort. For another major player, there's the Maker's Cult as well, a collection of creators who seem to work together a bit and have a Patreon page plus a main store. And after a past video, I had a bit of contact with one of their lead sculptors who reached out and said they were fine to share their models. They've got a human infantry sort of range called the Jade Coalition, an interesting combination of futuristic infantry plus some interesting Walker and Skimmer type models. Here are a few more of those. I do quite like their sort of Cyclopean helmets here. Could be appropriate for a few different things really. Maybe cultists out of various Chaos armies or even Genestealer cult neophytes maybe. I did quite like their Juggernauts as well. Hulking great big brutes with melee weapons and shields could be interesting enough for a Bulgrin squad. I've got a bunch of other ranges, including their Feudal Guard. I do rather like their sculpt on Bulgrin type things again here with the knightly helmets and everything like that. Could certainly imagine that coming from a 40k feudal world. They've also got some tanks and artillery support pieces. They may be feeling a little bit more on the nose with the 40k proxy offerings here, things that could clearly stand in for Wyverns, Manticores and Basilisks. And they do have a range called Valorcore as well, which could be good for Deathcore of Krieg. Lots of gas masks and World War I infantry sort of aesthetics going on there. Finally, I feel like one of my favourite ranges that they do are the Iron Hive, basically sort of mechanised aliens that could make some really quite interesting Tyranid proxies. I really like the twist on the concept of a swarm, but make it robotic. There's a few fun ones here that could maybe stand in for a Lictor or a Death Leaper, plus perhaps a Hive Tyrant on the right. And I've got things that could be suitable proxies for other things in the range, maybe depending on size of printing. That Subterrax could be used maybe as a Trigon, and the Larvas will be quite nice for Ripper swarms. Perhaps the miniatures and armies are some of the most exciting things to get into 3D printing though, but I'd certainly bear in mind all the other applications out there. Maybe one that doesn't tend to be quite as front and centre could be 3D printing bases. I feel like they particularly go well with it, just given that they're kind of materials light, so wouldn't use up all that much resin or anything, wouldn't need much supporting, and generally if bought from other suppliers tend to cost at least a fair bit relative to how much stuff you get. Plus you might get a supplier that doesn't exactly match up with the amount of miniatures that you want the bases for. These are fairly easy to search out there from multiple different providers. Once you've bought the STL from wherever it comes from, then you can then have as many of those as you want. You could have things like industrial bases or flagstone textures. Here's just one example from one on Cults 3D. Otherwise, you could certainly use 3D printers for adding aesthetics, personal touches and customization to plastic armies. Perhaps one of the most common ideas that I've seen at least a fair bit, say if you collected an army of generic Space Marines and you wanted to give them more twist to say be more White Scars or more Space Wolves or something like that. In general, there tends to be quite a lot of love and support for that in 3D printing communities around the place. In particular, one bit that people quite like are 3D printed chapter icons, things that could fit snugly onto shoulder pads for say an intercessor. Means that can be a pretty easy way to add a bit of theme to your miniatures, and also for the most part beats Games Workshop upgrade sprues, given that they just tend to be just massively expensive for the amount of parts and customization you get. Can be quite nice for other themed bits and pieces, maybe some swords or shields that more represent your chapter a little bit more than the generic Space Marine offering. Again, quite a lot of love and support for that out there in various 3D communities if you do a bit of searching. You can also use this for things like themed accessories for the tabletop, maybe wound counters or gaming aids that could help you out in battle and make something that's really bespoke to your exact force. Otherwise, another huge one, as mentioned, would be terrain sets. I feel like this is another great application for 3D printers, though it might be a little bit more helpful if you have a larger one rather than, say, a more entry-level one. In general, Games Workshop terrain tends to be a little bit on the pricey side for how much plastic you get, and resin or FDM printed terrain can be kind of interesting just for the sheer amount of quantity that you can get once you have a design. Plus, like things with the bases, there's not really much restriction on all sorts of creators going kind of mad with these and making their own things. As generic sci-fi terrain is pretty easy to make. I wouldn't necessarily be going anywhere near the Warhammer IP. Just for one example I found fun was this distillery factory by Print Minis on my mini factory. Looks like a really fun and pretty detailed terrain set with a few convoluted interlocking parts and pipes and things. I like the look of the modular nature of this one. In any case, whichever you're going for, finding a Warhammer appropriate STL can be a bit of a dark art. It really has found itself being a bit of a cottage industry over the past few years. Lots of creators making their own miniature ranges out there in a more or less formal capacity. Some just completely fan made and making their designs and putting them on the internet for free. Some little teams of creators trying to make things that people want to buy. As mentioned before, lots of them tend to be either just completely distinct miniature ranges, just of generic sci-fi armies, or tend to be clearly aping Games Workshop in one way or another. Perhaps the most common place to try and find these places are things like My Mini Factory, Cults 3D, various creator Patreons out there, and maybe in particular following along with social media. If you're joining 3D printing communities and Reddits and Discords, you might be able to highlight a bunch of designs that you haven't come across otherwise. As good a place to start as any can just be googling X Warhammer Army and 3D printed proxies for it. You can usually find at least some interesting stuff for say people discussing it on Reddit or other forums. And as mentioned, maybe particularly well supported things tend to be Space Marine and Guard proxies, given that there can be loads of just generic human infantry out there in or out of power armor and armed with sci-fi weaponry, and that's not really something that Games Workshop can say wholly belongs to them. As mentioned, barring just a few bigger creators who really know what they're doing, I'm a bit wary of sharing other things here. Plenty of smaller creators who are towing the line a bit more might risk Games Workshop's retribution, so it's going to be one that you can find designs for yourself, really. If you do go down the line of getting these 3D printed proxies, though, I feel like a few people out there might be just a bit apprehensive as to rocking up to games or tournaments with them. Perhaps kind of understandable if all you've known so far are miniatures from Games Workshop and them being played with. The printed models are definitely becoming a more normal thing, I think. I think for the vast majority of people who you're playing with in-game, maybe the biggest questions are, is it clear what the model is and what it's armed with? Is it the right sort of size to represent the miniature that you're trying to proxy in? You don't really want something that's vastly bigger or vastly smaller to give in-game advantages or disadvantages. And perhaps most importantly of all, does the miniature actually look good on the tabletop? I feel like people are going to be far more happy to play against something that's clearly an army that's had loads of love and effort put into it, both with cool designs and being painted, as opposed to something that's just an unpainted, low effort copy of a Games Workshop model just printing out the flavour of the month army. In my experience, tournaments and events tend to be at least reasonably accommodating. Most tournaments out there will be organised by independent hobby shops or bigger events, though it can vary from place to place and store to store. You need to take a look at the actual specific entry requirements as to whether or not your 3D printed proxies will be welcome or not. At least speaking from experience in the UK, I've seen plenty of proxied armies playing at really quite big grand tournaments and events. Unless it's actually official Games Workshop events, most people tend to be at least fairly accommodating, though obviously bearing in mind being clear and having the right size miniatures. I guess the main downsides would be not being welcome in Warhammer stores themselves or their own official events. Might be completely irrelevant to a lot of people out there though who don't have stores nearby. I think I would maybe tread just a little bit carefully with friendly local gaming stores who might have their own policies on the subject. I certainly wouldn't try and be the guy who's just rocking up to a local gaming store and using their gaming space and literally never spend anything in store while you play with your 3D printed proxies. I feel like most store owners will be fairly cool, but if you're just literally just never spending money and using their things and expecting them to keep on providing the service, that's just kind of unrealistic. I certainly make sure that you're supporting your local. Another thing I bear in mind when getting into 3D printing is whether or not you personally need to own the printer in question. I feel like for a fair few people out there who maybe don't have the time but have a bit more disposable income, you might just be better off commissioning someone to print parts for you if you don't want to get into the entire hobby of it and just want to focus on the actual miniatures that you'd get out of it. Can still be really quite flexible to have printed bits arriving in the post. You could either get things off things like Shapeways or Etsy, or find independent creators who will print on demand. The major trade-off here is that they just have a fairly massive reduction in savings per part, at least once you've got the initial purchase of your printer up and running. You might also have some luck in finding people printing within a small community as well. Plenty of hobby groups might have one or two people who are really into their printing and happy to take some commission requests for other people, maybe charging some mates rates to get their own little forge of models going, and could be a small side hustle for people who happen to have a printer. Getting back to a little bit more resin printing practicalities, troubleshooting can certainly be one issue with resin printers, and I wouldn't be too disheartened by the odd failed print or having a few trial runs to get things working properly. It does happen to a fair few people out there. Once you're getting a resin printer running, one of the first things that you'd probably think about doing is to print out the generic test model that comes with the printer. They generally have some sort of cool miniature sculptors advertised that can be printed off to try and make sure things are working properly and check things are calibrated. Another thing you can do is print off a calibration test print, such as the one pictured. There's plenty of those out there in the community. Not too hard to Google them to find some designs. This one's by All3DP. Again, it's probably best off finding a more technical guide as to the various different ways that prints can fail. Maybe some more common causes can be extremes of temperature. Resin can be really quite sensitive to that, perhaps particularly for plenty of places around the world where things are a bit colder, and they often might be where you're printing, as you might want to have a window open for ventilation. Exact temperature and humidity can often be rectified a little bit by resin calibration. That's partly what this test print is for, seeing whether or not you can get the resolution that should be possible on the printer, and you can potentially start out with manufacturer's advice settings and then tweak things a little bit based on advice on the community. And certainly make sure though that your surface is flat for doing the 3D print. That can also cause problems. There's enough supports in place, potentially adding more with your slicing software if problems are happening, and it's worth having some spare FEP sheets on hand for replacement if yours happens to get damaged, as that can be a really annoying fault to deal with. Perhaps one of the easiest ways though, if you are having trouble, is to just join one of the printing communities and ask questions as to your printer in question. That could be one of the very easiest ways to get some very practical advice tailored to your specific situation, as things can really vary quite a bit from provider to provider. Finally, and as I like to try and mention with just about every 3D printing video that I've done on the channel, safety is absolutely paramount. If you are going to pick up a resin 3D printer, then you need to treat the resin with respect. It's really not worth cutting corners and risking any sort of health consequences for cheap fancy models. Usually in life we're not coming into hazardous chemicals on a daily basis, and if you are going to start doing that, then you need to make sure that nothing goes wrong. Firstly, I'd absolutely treat resin as if it were poison. It is toxic and you don't want that on your skin, in your eyes, or being breathed in. When you're handling resin, ideally you should have gloves on, have a mask and have safety glasses to stop splashes. And in general, have the 3D printer set up in a place where if you're spilling things, then it's going to be contained and easy to clear up with isopropyl alcohol. A funnel can be pretty handy to have to transfer any resin from the vat back into the bottle. And make sure that you have some safe washable places for models to land if you're transferring them between the printer and the washing and curing machine, and not just improvising something ad hoc. When the printer's actually running, you want it in a room with ventilation, and ideally I'd not want it in a room that I'm spending significant amounts of time in. Something like a garage or a utility is generally the best idea for most people, I think, depending on your exact living situation. Most modern 3D printers do come with an air filter, and it definitely does help out with the smell and things, though it doesn't necessarily mean that you're removing all the harmful chemicals from the air. I'd treat that as a nice to have, but it's not really an excuse for inadequate ventilation. This definitely can be a barrier for plenty of people. Not everyone has just a spare space in their house that's appropriate to run a 3D printer, and that can be one of the issues with getting into it as a hobby. Finally, any alcohol, water, or just about anything else in contact with resin that you're going to throw away needs to be disposed of safely. Ideally, it should be left out in UV light for a good amount of time to try and make sure that any resin in it has cured. You really don't want to be just chucking hazardous chemicals out there into the environment to cause problems after you're done with them. That definitely wouldn't be a very socially responsible corner to cut. In any case though, hope that's been a somewhat helpful rough overview of 3D printing for miniature wargames. And as always with these sort of videos, please feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Any other major tips or things that I've missed will be greatly appreciated. As mentioned, I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert on the subject. If you were looking to pick one up though and get some cool designs on the tabletop, feel free to check out that Elegoo link down in the video description. The barrier to entry really isn't too bad at all, at least compared with equivalent amounts of Games Workshop's plastic kits, and it seems to be just getting better and better a hobby to get into with all the technological innovations over the past 5 to 10 years. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming here, with occasional forays into 3D printing here and there. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep those videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.